So Carter Soules is an associate professor of film studies in the English department at SUNY Brockport. He has written on the cannibalistic hillbilly in 1970s slasher films on environmental apocalyptic themes. In 1960s horror, is co-editor with Christy Tidwell of Fear and Nature, Eco-Horror Studies in the Anthropocene, which I'm reading right now. And he is writing a book on eco-horror cinema called Approaching Eco-Horror Cinema. Carter, let's hear from you.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh, and thanks to everyone for being here. And thank you, John, for your opening comments. Very thoughtful. Um, I want to start by saying, just as you did, Josh, what I'm not going to cover. When you asked me to sort of introduce eco-horror, or sort of say what the state of eco-horror might be, I mean, for one thing, my expertise is in cinema. And so I'm going to begin by speaking to some literary, important literary roots of eco-horror, but most of my examples and most of my talk will center on cinema. Also, I think eco-horror, as I'll say just right from the beginning, is a really big category, and it's only getting bigger in recent years and months, So by design, this is meant as to be kind of a thumbnail sketch or an introduction, but there's no way I could exhaustively play out all the various subgenres or the genre connections. And in fact, my talk is somewhat influenced by Charwood. So what I'd like to do is by the end, tie some of my comments back to how I see certain eco-horrific themes or tropes playing out in Charwood, but only in a very brief, non-spoilery way. Eco-horror is a genre or a mode built around the fear and horror that arises when humans encounter the non-human world. And that in itself is a pretty broad term, right? The non-human world. But I essentially mean that in its broadest sense. Anything not considered to be of humanity or of civilization kind of gets lumped into the non-human world. So anytime we encounter that, there's this possibility of fear and horror. And that can run a couple different ways. Sometimes we are fearful or horrified by what nature is going to do to us, right? And that's probably the most common form of eco-horror, the so-called revenge of nature style of eco-horror, where giant sharks or trees or weather or plants or whatever come after us, usually seeking bloody vengeance of some kind. But there's also the reverse of that, which is fear of what humans do to the environment or to nature. Interestingly, I think both things are present in Charwood. And I think these days, a lot of the more recent eco-horror films that I'll talk about engage usually with both of those modes at once. I would say eco-horror to some extent has its origins maybe in the literary Gothic. It may even go way before that. Obviously, the novel Charwood, among other things, shows us some of the connections possibly between eco-horror themes and the Judeo-Christian tradition and, folklore going way back. But in terms of modern eco-horror, which is actually my focus and my expertise, I'm going to say it starts with the literary Gothic. I'm thinking of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and the way Fog and the Moors are definitely characters in that novel. Or Algernon Blackwood, the Willows, came to mind when I was thinking of this talk, in part because it involves trees. On the American side, I might mention Edgar Allan Poe is often a key author for eco-critics. And again, that's not my expertise. I do film, but I know a lot of my colleagues work on Poe and have sort of mentioned him as a key figure in sort of an early eco-horror fiction. As far as cinema goes, I mainly want to talk tonight about films released after 1962. And that is because, here we go. While there are some important films that come before that, I would say King Kong may be chief among them. King Kong has been named by the authors of an anthology on animal horror cinema as perhaps the sort of origin point for animal horror cinema. It's one of the key texts of that. And we're still remaking King Kong endlessly, even when we're not remaking King Kong, right? Pretty much every Jurassic Park film owes some debt to King Kong. I mean, every blockbuster film owes some debt to King Kong. So at any rate, a very important eco-horror film. And as you can see from my image on the screen, this brings one of the most important motifs of eco-horror to the fore, which is that, if you will, country-city split, the city person's fear of the wilderness. And here in this image, obviously, King Kong represents that kind of wild nature. He's a wild animal of sorts, and he's invading our very civilized New York City here. But that country versus city motif, fear of wilderness, undergirds pretty much all eco-horror, right? It's that human versus non-human worlds clashing. But at any rate, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring comes out in 1962, and while it's a nonfiction work written by a biologist, it's actually in some ways a work of apocalyptic eco-horror. And if you've ever read Silent Spring, you know that it even opens, the first chapter sort of paints this picture of a little idyllic town that has lost its wildlife, and the birds don't sing anymore, and the water is polluted. So I would argue that Silent Spring is itself a work of eco-horror. I would also point to the fact that I'm not going to talk much about documentaries here, but there are many documentaries that would surely count as eco-horror. I mean, I could just rattle off a long list of those, because as I think we were joking earlier about how the hurricane is happening and the wildfires are happening, and so all of this stuff is actually happening in real life. At any rate, Silent Spring clearly inspired Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds in 1963, and I think The Birds is a very important eco-horror film because it's not like King Kong, a lost world film, right? Or not like Godzilla or the other 1950s creature features where it's usually nuclear energy that somehow creates the problem, right? Godzilla is essentially a high-powered nuclear mutant of some kind. But The Birds in 1963 introduces us to horrific protagonists or monsters, I suppose, the birds, who are just mundane average birds, right? They're not mutant. Their actions are never fully explained. Their motives are left unclear or implicit. So in a lot of ways, The Birds is one of those kind of ultimate expressions of that revenge of nature motif. Because if you've seen The Birds recently, you kind of end that movie knowing that the birds are pretty much, they're going to wipe us out. But Hitchcock is kind of brilliant in how he denies us any kind of explanation for why that's happening. So we're left to kind of chew that over on our own. All of this is preamble, though, to the moment when eco-horror as a film genre really comes to its own, which is in the 1970s. And I would argue that this is in part due to the release of Silent Spring and some of this other groundwork that I'm talking about. And in the 70s, you have a kind of long run of films that deal with these topics. Excuse me. Most of them are animal horror films, and I put Frogs up here because it's a personal favorite. And if you've never seen Frogs from 1972, I strongly recommend it. And in Frogs, the frogs and their various other reptilian and amphibious colleagues attack a bunch of overprivileged white people, in part because those white people have been polluting the local waterways. They are industrialists, and the industrial waste from their business has been polluting things. This is also a theme in 1979's Prophecy. So again, you see that human agency, human action is what provokes the attacks of the monsters and the attacks of nature. I was talking at the beginning about how this is the 2,000-pound shark in the room. Jaws is probably the most famous and profitable of all eco-horror films. I mean, maybe with the exception of Jurassic Park and some of its sequels now. But Jaws is clearly a key eco-horrific text. You got a giant shark attacking a seaside community. And the key thing that's on display in Jaws that I think is important is that the shark is a threat to capitalism. Mayor Vaughn wants to keep the beaches open because he doesn't want Amity Island to have a unprofitable summer. And so he makes some ethically shaky decisions because of the profit motive. And I think that's a really important motive, and it's a thing we see a lot in more current eco-horror as well. So I also want to note the influence of Peter Benchley's novel Jaws, which sometimes, especially in my business in film studies, gets a little overlooked. But a scholar who I like a lot, Jennifer Schell, has specifically noted that the novel Jaws is not only responsible for spawning the film and its sequels, but also is probably responsible for the other major shark genre, which is the megalodon genre, because there's a passage in Jaws where Hooper is speculating about the presence of megalodons and whether they could be out there. And of course, there's a whole body of literature and film around that now, most famously Steve Alten's Meg series, which there have now been 2 movies. The second one just came out about 3-4 weeks ago. So that passage where Hooper wonders at the possibility of megalodons could also be seen as a sort of connective tissue binding Jaws to the Jurassic Park franchise, because the megalodon belongs to an extinct species or a presumed extinct species. And so when you're dealing with Jurassic Park or the Meg or any of these kind of films, you're bringing in that motif of a de-extinct species being brought back to life or being rediscovered. And when you do that, as my colleague Christy Tidwell has pointed out, you are also always talking about the possibility of extinction for other species, especially humans, right? And in fact, these films often boil down to a kind of extinction race between the creatures that have been awakened and us. And if they survive, they're going to wipe us out for sure. So that's just another motif that's in there, along with the de-extinction plot is also connected, I think, to the Frankenstein / overreaching mad scientist plot, right? Because there's always a Hammond figure or somebody who is messing in God's domain and doing things they shouldn't be by awakening or creating these creatures. So I've mentioned animal horror. I've mentioned de-extinction films. There's a couple other subgenres I want to touch on real quickly, and I am aware that I'm down to only a few minutes here. But one of the other major subgenres, one that I'm obsessed with right now and that I've been working on a chapter about this summer, is petro-horror. That is, horrors arising specifically from the fossil fuel industry, our use of such fuels, the negative outcomes of doing so, etc. So 2 films that leap to mind in that respect are The Last Winter and Deepwater Horizon. But there's tons of these. Anytime you have a monstrous vehicle going around killing people, as in, say, Maximum Overdrive or Steven Spielberg's Duel or something like this, I think you're in the realm of petro-horror. Obviously, the Mad Max franchise is another important petro-horrific franchise. But I also think CHARWOOD gets in on some of the petro-horror, at least petro-horror adjacent kind of stuff, what with the biomass and some of the other themes that the protagonists and their nemesis are engaging with. Finally, and I'm kind of heading for my conclusion now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the rise of so-called cli-fi cinema, climate fiction, and I'm sure on the literary side, that might be a more rich, bigger deal than I'm about to make it sound. But on the film side, cli-fi and climate change cinema, obviously very important, and it kind of starts in the mid-2000s with The Day After Tomorrow, I would say, Roland Emmerich's film, which came out just a year before Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. So it's kind of like 05, 06 is a key turning point for cli-fi cinema. But then after that, I feel like often climate change becomes a theme that gets integrated into other cinematic genres a little more so than it really functions as a standalone genre. And as I was trying to think of other cli-fi films, what I actually ended up with were a lot of these sort of smaller, I'm going to call them artsier, I guess, or more intimate films. Ones like Take Shelter here, which again, if you've never seen, I want to strongly recommend Take Shelter. This is a wonderful film. And if you're interested in these issues, I would just strongly recommend this great movie. Beasts of the Southern Wild comes to mind in this connection. I might even mention The Happening, even though I don't know how great a film that truly is, but surely it's interested in this larger question of climate change and how it's affecting things on a kind of more of a global scale. So I will wrap up simply by mentioning a couple other key subgenres that I have had to leave out. Things like cosmic horror, I think that was mentioned earlier. There's biological horror / body horror, right? I haven't really talked about those. And then maybe the other most important genre that's directly relevant to Charwood, and I'm going to stop sharing now and come back and see you all, is folk horror. And I just want to end by saying that folk horror is a huge, I know there's been a big surge in the production of folk horror texts of late and films, things like The Witch, among others, and tons of others. But also it's a really big topic in terms of eco-criticism right now. Folk horror is just exploding. And in particular, there's a scholar, Dawn Keatley, and I think you can see her work for free on a website called Horror Homeroom. So if you don't know Horror Homeroom, maybe go peek at that. But Dawn Keatley is doing some really cutting edge work examining folk horror. And I think Charwood is also doing some very cutting edge work integrating eco-horror with folk horror, in this case specifically Jewish folk horror. So I'll end there, and I just want to thank everyone again for listening to me for 15 minutes. Thanks.